8 o'clock, Hollywood goes to town.
It's Hollywood, where everybody wants to be a star. Woo! The casting couch has been a persistent image in entertainment since the early 20th century. For all of its public posturing with the Me Too movement, critics say the entertainment industry is surprisingly backwards in striking respects.
When I say Hollywood hypocrisy, when it applies to this topic, what does that make you think of?
We have known that casting couch culture promotes sexual violence for a century, and we've done nothing about it.
There's been a real lack of understanding, what happened to me and those other women in the hallway.
In 1991, the word tailhook became synonymous with sexual harassment in the military. Decades later, the nation's largest employer is trying to answer a question many are asking: what defines sexual harassment?
The Marine Corps would record whether or not alcohol or drug use was involved in a sexual harassment incident, and the other services didn't. The services categorized sexual harassment differently.
There's a new name in the war on terror you might want to note: ISIS Philippines. We were there last summer as ISIS was losing footing in Iraq and Syria and sending seasoned fighters fleeing the Mideast to the Philippines.
We've had reports and information coming in that there's been foreign fighters from Saudi, from Yemen, etc., down in Mindanao for 4 years now.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. This year's Academy Awards was the first since a cascade of sexual misconduct allegations against top entertainment moguls. In spite of promises to stick to the movies, the Oscars offered the usual sequel, brave stands that seemed as scripted as the films. It's an industry that has long aligned publicly with causes that advance and protect women. So for this week's cover story, we decided to go to L.A. and dig into Hollywood hypocrisy.
8 o'clock, Hollywood goes to town.
The sky ablaze with searchlights of every hue, photographers' flashlights popping everywhere, crowds of fans.
It's Hollywood, where everybody wants to be a star. Woo! Once in a blue moon, a star is born. Sometimes it turns out with help from the casting couch.
Lights flash, cameras click, the stars arrive, the most glittering parade in history.
The casting couch has been a persistent image in entertainment since the early 20th century.
The lovely usherettes are given a last-minute inspection.
Dancer Agnes DeMille once spoke of the casting couch supposedly operated by Broadway theater pioneers. They ran a brothel, she said. If you didn't sleep with them, you didn't get the part.
You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today.
Over the last 100 years, it turns out Hollywood hasn't really come such a long way. For all of its public posturing with the Me Too movement, critics say the entertainment industry is surprisingly backwards in striking respects.
How women are portrayed in films, how many women have speaking roles, and women that are in, sexualized positions and wearing, scanty attire. Hollywood is not, innocent in how society treats women.
Meg James covers the business of entertainment for the LA Times.
Does the entertainment industry have a double standard when it comes to sexual misconduct?
When the Access Hollywood tapes came out, everyone in Hollywood went nuts. They took to Twitter. Everyone was condemning the behavior that Trump, was captured on audio tape talking about. And then Harvey Weinstein happens, and there was, for 3 or 4 days, there was just silence. And to me, that struck me as being a double standard.
It's not that easy, Scarlett.
Watch iconic films today, and some find the most memorable scenes cringeworthy in terms of message.
This is one night you're not turning me out.
A friend said to me the other day, I watched an old James Bond movie, and there was a sexual assault in every scene. That wasn't presented as a sexual assault. It was presented as some sort of, romantic plot in the film.
Now let's both play.
I think we live in a rape culture. And I define that as a culture that both doesn't take rape seriously as a crime, but also eroticizes and celebrates sexual violence.
Caroline Heldman is a professor of politics and a survivor advocate. She says she was let go as a TV commentator for rebuffing the advances of a senior executive.
When I say Hollywood hypocrisy, when it applies to this topic, what does that make you think of?
Hollywood hypocrisy pertaining to sexual violence, I think, refers to the fact that we have known that casting couch culture promotes sexual violence for a century, and we've done nothing about it. For many people, it's just a PR stunt, because if you knew about this issue 20, 30 years ago, and you had the power to do something about it, why didn't you do something about it?
When we talked about the double standard, one thing that I was thinking back to was Ashley Judd speaking so judgmentally, perhaps rightfully so, of her thoughts on President Trump and his behavior, yet not at the time revealing what had allegedly happened to her.
I am a nasty woman. I'm not as nasty as a man who looks like he bathes in Cheeto dust.
So projecting against somebody else, not related to her situation, while in her own backyard, all of this was going on.
I think that's a fascinating observation. When Ashley talked to Variety a couple years before, she talked about being assaulted by a studio head. And at the time, people thought that it was Harvey Weinstein, but she wouldn't utter his name. And I think that was the power of the reporting by the New York Times, Ronan Farrow with the New Yorker and others, was finally women came together and said, we can protect each other, we can speak out. So I think that for Ashley, there probably was a few years of trying to figure out, come to grips with this behavior.
You had said the sordid allegations against Weinstein put Hollywood and Democrats in an awkward spot. What was the awkward spot in a nutshell?
That Harvey Weinstein had been a major fundraiser for Hillary Clinton, had been close to the Clintons for years. He was a power broker not only in Hollywood circles and Oscar voting, but also in Democratic politics. I think for the Democrats, and I think they're continuing to wrestle with this, I think that's one of the reasons why Al Franken was tossed so quickly, was how do they become the party of zero tolerance when such behavior is so widespread? And when they've also benefited from people who have alleged to have perpetrated the behavior.
Do you think some of the big Hollywood power brokers may have gotten a pass over the years because they contribute so much to the Democratic Party and to liberal interests?
I think the reason that Hollywood power brokers have been protected has a lot more to do with the fact that they have fiefdoms, and that Hollywood runs on these informal fiefdoms where you develop a lot of power and then you dole out favors, jobs, you get contracts. And so we place a lot of power in the hands of a very small number of people, and that's what protects them, not their association with the Democratic Party.
Christine Parath teaches at Georgetown University and studies uncivil behavior in the workplace.
When I've talked to people that work in Hollywood production firms and things like that, one of the things that they've said is many people get treated like props that eat, that's how people roll. Unless you have high status, you don't get the respect.
Do you think Hollywood is going to see some sort of big sea change now because of this?
I do. I think I've been very impressed with the way that women have spoken up about it and how they've bonded together to try to set new norms for the industry.
Heldman isn't optimistic in the long term.
Do you think some of these women speaking out now in Hollywood may suffer repercussions if we look in 3 years, 5 years down the road?
The problem with coming forward in order to raise awareness is that it still comes with retaliation. I would like to see 3 to 5 years out what sort of retaliation the women who've spoken up in Hollywood are facing. My guess is that they will experience very high rates of retaliation, mostly in subtle forms, right, where they're labeled a troublemaker and they don't get hired at other places.
The closing lines of this particular Hollywood story are still being written. Will scandal retire the casting couch once and for all? What will happen to the faded heroines who are bringing the problems to light?
The clock moves on. Hollywood, again has gone to town.
Hollywood isn't the only sector struggling with sexual misconduct. Ahead on Full Measure, how the nation's largest employer, the military, has struggled with decades of sexual misconduct in the ranks. New recommendations to stop the problem. In terms of sexual assault allegations, the military could be seen as a trendsetter. A decades-old scandal was so shocking at the time it began a serious evaluation of the role of women in the ranks. Years later, Josie Sturman finds one reason why a fix has been so hard. The military doesn't even agree on what constitutes sexual misconduct.
There's been a real lack of understanding. A lack of understanding what happened to me and those other women in the hallway. A lack of understanding on exactly how to handle that situation, and a lack of understanding on why it's so important that that kind of behavior not be tolerated.
In 1991, the word tailhook became synonymous with workplace sexual harassment, and Paula Coughlin became the face of the scandal. More than 80 women were allegedly assaulted during an annual event for sailors and Marines called the Tailhook Symposium in Las Vegas.
What happened to me was criminal, and that it had to be stopped.
In the aftermath of that investigation, the role of women in the military went through significant changes. Now, the nation's largest employer, the Department of Defense, is taking a new approach to track and police sexual harassment.
We've seen top leadership at times at DOD be very forthcoming and prioritize some of these issues like sexual assault as we will have zero tolerance. We haven't seen that for sexual harassment. It is something that's on their radar, but they just haven't moved it up as a high priority.
Brenda Farrell has spent a decade watching the military's efforts to police sexual misconduct as a watchdog for the Government Accountability Office. While the DoD has made sweeping changes to deal with sexual assault, a recent audit found the agency has been missing the mark when it comes to targeting the progression of unwanted sexual behavior. It's something they call the continuum of harm.
There's been some studies, the research is out, there's an understanding where sexual harassment fits on this continuum, and that you need more information in order to prevent criminal crimes that are, sexual assault.
Tracking incidents of sexual harassment, according to the GAO's report, differs depending on the branch of the military.
Some of the services collected information that the other services didn't. For example, the Marine Corps would record whether or not alcohol or drug use was involved in a sexual harassment incident, and the other services didn't. Another thing that stood out to us that was different was the services categorized sexual harassment differently.
To change that, the GAO offered recommendations to standardize reporting for sexual harassment. The DoD agreed with the recommendations. They denied our request for an interview, but in a statement they told us, the department is firmly committed to eliminating sexual harassment from the armed forces and does not tolerate or condone these behaviors.
The culture is ready for this. The country is ready for this. I think the vast majority of men and women who serve are ready for this. We just need the people wearing those stars on their shoulders to step up to the plate.
Retired Air Force Colonel Don Christensen is a former Judge Advocate General, military prosecutor, and lawyer. He's now the president of Protect Our Defenders, a national group focused on combating sexual violence and harassment in the military. Christensen says because of its well-established leadership structure, the DoD may just be the best group of any to tackle the problem of sexual harassment. If they create and set new and clear standards, Christensen says the impact could reach far beyond the ranks of the military.
Do you see this as an opportunity for the DoD to be an example to other branches, to private industry?
I think the DoD, if they were to tackle this seriously, could be as big as the Me Too movement, probably even bigger than the Me Too movement, because they have such a broad impact on the entire country. Obviously we have the biggest budget. We are the world's largest employer. which often is lost, I think, on people. And so if the world's largest employer can solve this, that's a great example for the rest of the world.
Any idea when something's going to be done?
So the DoD tells us they'll have hopefully a uniform definition soon, and then they plan to put the recommendations that were made in place by 2019. But we have heard this before. Similar report in 2011, the DoD said it would take action, but they didn't. Hopefully different results this time.
Like you say, starting with the definition seems huge.
Yep.
Thanks. Coming up on Full Measure, new evidence ISIS is seeking to start an independent state in the Philippines. We were there at a new front on Islamic extremism, terrorism. The State Department has just added 7 Islamic extremist terrorist groups to the U.S. list of terrorists, including ISIS Philippines. As we told you when we visited the Philippines last year, ISIS is a growing force there with the intent of establishing an independent state or caliphate in Southeast Asia.
By the Congress.
We were there when the Philippine Congress extended martial law in the troubled Mindanao region of the southern Philippines. Philippine military officials recently warned that ISIS has built a force of fighters there, where we also visited, in a continuing fight by Islamic extremists to establish an independent state or caliphate that can stage terror attacks throughout Southeast Asia. We're invited aboard military fast boats accompanied by heavily armed commandos. It's the safest way to see the worst areas. Our guide is a hero in this long-standing war against Islamic extremist terrorists, General Lito Sobihana. He heads up a joint task force of the Philippine military. The battle actually goes back decades.
That island is the island province of Basilan. I was stationed there in the 90s, and I was even wounded in that island, seriously wounded, because I had 5 gunshot wounds all over my body and several sharp.
Fighting Abu Sayyaf.
Fighting is Abu Sayyaf.
Abu Sayyaf is considered one of the most violent Islamic jihadist groups, responsible for the Philippines' worst terrorist attack, the 2004 bombing of a ferry that murdered 116 people. Sobihana received the Philippine Medal of Honor for his heroics in fighting Abu Sayyaf in the 90s. 2 decades later, Abu Sayyaf is now said to be lining up with ISIS, prompting some to make the argument that Islamic extremism in the Philippines deserves more of the world's attention.
We are now in the middle of the 2 islands of Santa Cruz. These islands are part of Zamboanga. And
earlier, we spoke with General Sobihana at Camp Navarro, headquarters of the Western Mindanao Command.
Could you explain in just a sentence or two to the American audience what the fighting is about?
Well, initially, they followed the ideology of establishing Islamic independence in Mindanao.
The vast majority of Filipinos are Christian. Most of the Muslims live in the south. Here in the troubled Mindanao province, 1 in 5 residents is Muslim, according to the 2000 census. ISIS didn't pioneer the notion of violently establishing an international Islamic state or caliphate. Muslim extremists in Mindanao have been conducting a terrorist campaign for an independent Islamic state since the 1970s.
We've had reports and information coming in that there's been foreign fighters from Saudi, from Yemen, etc., down in Mindanao for 4 years now.
Jean Yu is a former Green Beret with U.S. Special Forces supporting Philippine troops fighting the terrorists. He now helps run a private security firm here. He says with ISIS losing its footing in Iraq and Syria, seasoned fighters fleeing the Mideast are now showing up in the Philippines, where there are many sympathizers.
These guys are battle-hardened fighters or terrorists that have survived essentially the war, going head-to-head with Western military and special operations. These people are not dumb, okay? They're not incompetent fighters, right? To survive that long, only the best guys have survived that long.
In May, fighting escalated when hundreds of terrorists attacked the Philippine Army in the region's island city of Murrow, population 200,000. Civilians were taken hostage, thousands fled. Nearly the entire city was later evacuated. After months of fighting, 400 terrorists were dead. So were more than 100 civilians and Philippine troops. After the latest siege in Murrow, the Philippines has requested additional support from America in its ongoing fight against Islamic extremists. Last November, while visiting Manila, President Trump pledged $14.3 million in U.S. aid for the reconstruction of Murrow. Meantime, General Sobejana continues in his third decade of fighting a familiar and brutal enemy.
We've talked to some observers who really want this to obviously get under control because they fear people like the Islamic State and other extremists could see this as an opening, this region, to come in and spread more ideologically based violence here. Do you worry about that happening?
Well, I think there are indicators that they are here already.
Should we be worried about that?
Well, I think we should do something about it so that their number will not become large.
America is supporting the Philippines' fight against Islamic extremist terrorism. In the past 8 years, we've supplied them with more than $85 million in equipment for counterterrorism and $65 million to help with security at sea. We'll be right back. A follow-up to our story about animal testing conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA secretary now says he's against it. We first reported about animal experiments last spring. It's estimated that tens of thousands of dogs are used for medical testing, more than 1,000 of them in federal experiments at taxpayer expense. Among them, beagles tethered to treadmills and forced to run to stress their hearts. VA Secretary David Shulkin previously defended dog testing, saying it led to significant breakthroughs. But in a recent interview with Daily Caller, he shifted his stance.
I put a new policy in place at VA that there will be no additional research with dogs unless it got my approval.
AmVets, one of the nation's largest veterans groups, recently told Congress it supports the effort to phase out taxpayer funding for what it calls antiquated dog research. Next week on Full Measure, shades of gray. The Me Too movement empowered abused women to come forward and talk about misconduct that was in the shadows. But it's also drawing attention to the gray area between what's improper and what's illegal. And it opens the door for targets to be smeared by unproven claims.
I couldn't defend myself in the press. I was vilified in the national media and on social media. And the accusers and whatever political machine came after me used it to poison the water to make it almost impossible for me to get work.
Next week on Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.